I'm Anna Mitchell, and Kirsten Evans is joining us now. She's the Executive Director of In Defense of Christians. Kirsten, good morning.
Good morning, Anna. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining us. What was your reaction to the Paris terror attacks?
Oh, and I think like the rest of the world, my reaction was horror, right, and profound sadness for the community, for the families, and a deepened and growing concern about how we as an international community are going to be able to confront this growing threat of ISIS.
Well, my next question to you is, you said you expressed horror. Were you surprised by it, given the Christians' experience of ISIS in Iraq and Syria?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I think it took us by surprise, right? It took us by surprise, but certainly this technique of terrorism. Of course, terrorism is defined as specifically, unlike conventional warfare, it is warfare that's directed at the innocent. It's directed at civilians. It's directed at non-military people, and it's directed to cause and incite fear across an entire community. That's how ISIS has operated from day one. We know that those people that have lived in Syria and Iraq, in the parts of Syria and Iraq that ISIS that have subsequently become the so-called self-proclaimed Islamic State, have experienced horrendous atrocities and crimes against humanity on every level. It's a regime that seeks to govern and seeks to control by fear and by violence and by terror, both within their borders and then clearly without.
Well, the airwaves have been blanketed with coverage, and rightly so, of these attacks and the aftermath in Paris. But a narrative that really doesn't make the airwaves very often is that of the Christian experience of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Could you give us a glimpse of that?
Yeah, Anna, I think one of the things that sometimes in the Western world we don't realize, or maybe we're coming to realize, sometimes we're unfortunately a little bit ignorant of, and I speak for all of us, myself included some years ago, is just how much we are indebted to the Christian communities in the Middle East, and particularly Iraq and Syria. Oftentimes, I think before ISIS arose, many of us Christians in the Western world weren't even aware that there were Christians in the Middle East. These communities, the Christian communities of Iraq and Syria, go back to the apostolic times. These are some of the most ancient Christian communities that exist. These are communities that were evangelized by St. Paul, St. Mark, St. Thomas in Egypt. And really, the Middle East is the cradle and the seedbed of the first centuries of Christianity. So we are all deeply indebted to these communities for the faith that we hold today. With the rise and the emergence of ISIS over the last years, the Christian communities there have found themselves in increasing peril. They are a minority community, but they have lived for centuries in relative peace, being able to negotiate their way in sometimes difficult political and religious terrain. And they've been able to hold on to their faith, their culture, their churches, their monasteries, their liturgies, their communities, and pass that faith on down to their children. Last fall in Mosul, Iraq, for the first time in almost 2 centuries, the church bells in Mosul did not ring. ISIS has had a targeted campaign to eradicate the region of its Christian roots and of any remembrance of its Christian heritage. And it's the communities and the innocent that have been the target and the victim of that campaign of eradication. They have been subject to mass displacement. With hundreds of thousands of Christians that are living in refugee camps or living as internally displaced persons throughout the region, in Lebanon and Jordan. They have been the victims of mass execution, as we've seen with the beheading of the 21 Coptic Christians, with the 3 Assyrian Christians. the Ethiopian Christians, all of which ISIS is happy to, to put out there on YouTube and for all the world to see. They've been the victims of systematic rape. They've had their children kidnapped, who've been forced to join ISIS. They've had their girls sent to the ISIS sex slave trade. Their churches have been destroyed. Their businesses have been destroyed. Their homes have been taken over, and all of this has been done very openly by ISIS in an attempt to eradicate the region of its Christian heritage.
Do you think they'll succeed?
We hope not, right? And we pray not. I think the international community has an enormous responsibility to step in. We have been pushing here in Washington, D.C., very strongly a resolution in Congress that should be going up to vote, God willing, before Congress breaks for the holidays, which would ask the president to make a declaration of genocide and crimes against humanity, not just for the Christians, for the Yazidis who have suffered equally as much, if not more, than the Christian community has under ISIS, and all of the religious minorities. It's not only the Christians that ISIS is targeting. They do not want in their caliphate anyone who has a worldview or a religious view that is different than their own. And so any of the communities that think or believe or worship differently than they do, if you can say that they worship, are targets of eradication. Right? We are fighting very hard to push the international community to ensure, as we move forward in combating the problem of ISIS, that we have as a very high priority, if not a top priority, the protection and preservation of these ancient communities and their ancestral homeland, the protection and preservation of their ancestral lands that belong to them, and to the protection and preservation of these cultures that when the ISIS situation is resolved, God willing, and the dust settles, that these communities will be able to continue to live and thrive and flourish in the land that they've called their own for centuries.
You mentioned that In Defense of Christians is based in Washington, D.C., and of course the major topic of discussion that has been going on around Washington and across the country and really across the world is whether to prohibit or restrict the resettlement of Syrian refugees in light of the Paris attacks. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a very, very, very difficult question, and I think it's not one that's going to be easily solved. We are caught as a society between two very real imperatives. One imperative being the need to give humanitarian aid and assistance to people and to communities who have no other option, right? Who are facing the most dire of circumstances, and at the same time, we have a very real imperative and responsibility for our own national security. And these are hard questions. When you're pulling people from refugee camps, it's difficult to be able to verify oftentimes identity. Background checks can be quite hard when you're pulling someone from a refugee situation. Verifying identification papers can be very difficult. Now, the vetting, the screening process for United States refugees is quite lengthy. I think they say it takes anywhere from 18 to 24 months for a refugee who applies to go through that process and get to the United States. Many people say, look, if someone wants to come to the United States and do acts of terror, they're probably not going to come as a refugee, and there are more porous ways to enter the United States. So we need to strengthen all of those borders. We need to strengthen all of our national security and our customs and borders control, not simply the refugee situation. And at the same time, I think our policymakers have a big challenge in front of them. I do think the global community has a responsibility to find real and constructive ways to help these communities. That can also be by putting more aid into the region, by supporting the nations that are already housing many of these refugees. The country of Lebanon, for instance, at this stage, they say 1 in 4 people in Lebanon today is a refugee from Syria. We need giving more economic support and development and aid to Lebanon to help them deal with that crisis so that the Lebanese economy can maintain that kind of a strain. And I think ultimately we need to be looking at solutions, not just bringing refugees into the EU or into the United States, which I do think is a viable option, and that needs to be done carefully and with national security in mind. But we also need to be looking as an international community in the long term of how are we going to ensure these communities have a safe haven and have a place within the region of their actual homeland where they can live in safety and in peace. And can the international community begin providing that kind of safe structure for them in the region now?
Bishop Eusebio Elizondo, who is the chairman of the U.S. Bishops' Committee on Migration, issued a statement earlier this week saying that he was disturbed by the calls to end the resettlement of Syrian refugees, and ended his statement saying this, and I want your thoughts on it. Instead of using this tragedy to scapegoat all refugees, I call upon our public officials to work together to end the Syrian conflict peacefully so the close to 4 million Syrian refugees can return to their country and rebuild their homes. That's the ultimate goal, is it not? They want to go home.
Yes, they want to go home. And the bishop's absolutely right. We need to be calling upon the international community, working with the international community to resolve the conflict and to resolve the conflict peacefully, and to be providing for these communities safety and protection and safe havens within their own land. And I'm saying that that's not in contradiction to also receiving the most imperiled people within our own borders and within the EU. And as I said, it's very real that our nation's leaders have to do that while taking all necessary precautions for national security. And that's not an easy task in the world that we live in today. So, we can pray for them. We can offer them our support. We can certainly try to give constructive answers and solutions to that. There are no easy answers to this question.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you. Kirsten Evan, she's the Executive Director of In Defense of Christians. If listeners want to find out more about the work that you do, where's the best place to go?
They can visit our website. We are at www.indefenseofchristians.org, or we just had a recent summit a couple of months ago, www.idcconvention.org, and there's a lot of information on that second website, idcconvention.org, about the current activity that we're doing now.